The veranda faces north. The taiga begins about 20 paces past the rail. It is a summer morning in 1908 in the trading post of Vanavara, in the middle of nothing, in the middle of Siberia. A settler named Semen Semenov is on the rail. It is just past 7 in the morning. He is looking north over the trees because there is nothing else to look at. He has lived here for 30 years. He believes he is at the most boring place on earth.
Suddenly, the sky split in two. Above the forest, the sky was covered in fire. I felt great heat, as if my shirt had caught alight. I jumped up and tried to take it off, but at that moment, the sky shut. A strong wind threw me from the veranda, and I lay on the ground.
What struck Semen Semenov in 1908 has never been found. This is the Cold Archive. Central Siberia in 1908 was Russian Empire territory. Tsarist, remote, 4 years past a war with Japan, and 10 years from the revolutions. The nearest railway was 800 kilometers south of Vanavara. The stony Tunguska River wound past the village to the east. The Evenki people, who herded reindeer in the taiga, were the only neighbors for hundreds of kilometers. At 7:14 in the morning local time, something exploded in the sky about 65 kilometers north of Semenov's veranda. The blast was later estimated at between 10 and 30 megatons. It flattened approximately 80 million trees over 2,150 square kilometers. The air pressure wave reached the barometers of London 4 hours later.
The atmospheric phenomenon observed across the British Isles on the nights of June 30th and July 1st is without precedent in the records of the Royal Society.
For 3 nights, the sky over northern Europe stayed bright enough to read a newspaper at midnight. Stockholm, Antwerp, London, Berlin. Cities reported a strange silver dust in the upper atmosphere, catching enough light after dark to dim the stars. Nobody knew where it had come from. Nobody in Europe knew that anything had happened in Siberia. 800 kilometers south of the epicenter, the Trans-Siberian Express was running its usual track. The engineer reported the locomotive shaking on the rails. Passengers thought the train had derailed. The seismograph in Irkutsk recorded the event as a small earthquake. So did Tashkent. So did Tbilisi. The Evenki herders, closest to the epicenter, watched a fire fall through the sky from the north. 3 of them are believed to have been killed instantly by the blast or its heat. The exact number was never confirmed. The herders who survived refused to enter the burn zone afterward. They said the place belonged to the sky god Ogdi now. They walked their reindeer around it for the next 19 years. What had happened was felt across half a hemisphere. What had happened was photographed in the sky over London. What had happened had killed 3 reindeer herders. And what had happened would not be examined by any scientist for 19 years. Not until a young mineralogist in St. Petersburg picked up a report in a railway timetable and decided he could not let it stay unexamined. Leonid Kulik, born 1883, mineralogist at the Mineralogical Museum in St. Petersburg by 1921. He came across the Tunguska reports while traveling the Trans-Siberian to collect meteoritic samples. He believed from the press accounts alone that the largest meteorite in recorded history had landed in the Siberian taiga, and that no scientist had ever seen the crater. He spent the next 6 years writing to the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He spent the next 8 years organizing an expedition. The taiga in the 1920s was reachable only by river and by foot. The Civil War had ended 4 years before. Funding was thin. The first expedition launched in the spring of 1927. Kulik was 44 years old.
The local Evenki refused to take us into the zone. They believed the place was cursed by their sky god Ogdi. We hired guides who had only heard of the burned forest secondhand.
The expedition traveled 3 weeks by river and another 4 days by horse. When they reached the perimeter, what Kulik saw was not what he had spent 14 years preparing for. He had expected a crater. Instead, he saw a forest of tree trunks lying on the ground, all of them pointing in the same direction, away from a center point. He walked the perimeter for 2 days. The fallen trees made a radial pattern, 2,000 square kilometers of them, all pointing outward from a center. There was no crater. There was no fragment. There were just the trees. At the very center, the trees were still standing. Their branches had been blown off. Their bark had been scoured down to the white wood. They pointed at the sky like burned matchsticks. The trees half a kilometer away were horizontal. The trees at zero were vertical. The blast had come from directly above. This is the signature of an airburst, a meteoroid of approximately 50 to 80 meters across, entering the atmosphere at 30 kilometers per second, slowing under dense air, fragmenting at 5 to 10 kilometers altitude into a downward pressure pulse. The pulse flattens the forest in a radial pattern. The pulse leaves no impact mark because the projectile never reached the ground. Kulik searched the area in 1927, in 1928, in 1929, in 1939. He drained marshes looking for fragments. He took core samples. He took thousands of photographs. The fragments did not appear. The crater did not appear. He died in 1942 in a Nazi prisoner of war camp in Spasdemensk, with the projectile still unaccounted for and the question of its composition unsolved. In 1958, a follow-up expedition led by Kirill Florensky confirmed Kulik's measurements. The pattern was the same. The fragments were still missing. The Soviet Academy refined the energy estimate. The compositional question remained open. Every explanation for Tunguska sits inside one of four theories, and each one breaks against a constraint the data refuses to forgive. The first theory is a stony meteoroid, best fit on the airburst signature, the size, the lack of crater. The constraint that breaks it, a meteoroid of that size, even fragmenting at altitude, should have scattered detectable chondritic material across the forest floor. Soil studies have found microscopic spherules, but in quantities too small to settle the case. Where the rest of the projectile went is not explained. The second theory is a comet, proposed first by Soviet astronomer V.G. Fesenkov in 1949. A small, icy nucleus, perhaps 100 meters across, vaporizing entirely on entry, accounts for the bright nights over Europe, sublimating cometary ice spreads as fine reflective particles in the upper atmosphere. The constraint that breaks it, comet nuclei of that mass are cataloged long before they arrive. None was reported in approach in 1908. The 1908 sky was clean.
The morphology of Lake Cheko, the magnetic anomaly at its center, and the radioisotope dating of its sediment are all consistent with an impact origin in 1908.
The third theory is the most recent. In 2007, a research team led by Luca Gasparini at the University of Bologna proposed that a small lake 8 kilometers north-northwest of the epicenter is itself the impact crater of a fragment that survived the airburst. Sediment cores, magnetic readings, and the lake's elongated shape all fit. The paper was peer-reviewed and published in Terra Nova. The constraint that breaks it, an 1881 Russian Imperial Survey map shows Lake Cheko present in its current position 27 years before the explosion. The lake did not appear in 1908. It was already there. The Bologna team has proposed counter-arguments. The 1881 map remains the simplest objection. The fourth theory is the strangest. In 2020, a Russian research team led by D.E. Khrennikov published a paper in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society proposing that the Tunguska object never fully entered the atmosphere at all. It grazed, entered at an angle of 11 to 13 degrees above horizontal, released most of its kinetic energy as it skimmed, and exited back into space on its solar orbit. If the grazing hypothesis is correct, the Tunguska projectile is still somewhere in the inner solar system. It would now be entering its 118th post-Earth orbit. The constraint that breaks the theory, the seismic data records a clear vertical impulse at the epicenter. A tangential pass should not register that signature. The model fits some observations and breaks others. The standing dead trees, the radial fall pattern, the missing fragments, the bright nights over London. Every theory accounts for some of it. No theory accounts for all of it. The trees at the center are still upright today. They are dead. Their descendants have grown around them. They are the closest thing the event left to a physical record of itself. A forest of vertical, scoured trunks under 117 years of new growth. The bright nights over London lasted 3 days, and then they faded. And nobody in Europe ever learned that something had happened in Siberia. The connection was made only after Kulik's 1927 expedition. It took 19 years and 3 different empires to put the bright nights in the burned forest in the same sentence. And whatever it was, somewhere on an orbit we have not yet mapped, possibly still moving. Wednesday's case, December 4th, 1872. About 600 miles west of Portugal, the British brigantine de Gratia sighted another ship sailing erratically in a 25-knot wind, sails half set. They closed for 2 hours before boarding. Aboard, they found the wheel free, the cabin doors open, a captain's chart with course pricked through to November 24th, and 10 people missing. The lifeboat was gone. The cargo was intact. The Mary Celeste, Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern. See you then.